This is an MCP 5-minute moment, brought to you by the Massachusetts Department of Environmental Protection's Bureau of Wayside Cleanup. My name is Paul Locke. MassDEP has been receiving a lot of questions about two recent policies that deal with soil management in Massachusetts. So today we're going to do a simple compare and contrast between the Wayside Cleanup Similar Soils policy and the policy for the reclamation of quarries, sand pits, and gravel pits. The Similar Soils policy is actually Wayside Cleanup 13-500, and the Reclamation Soil policy is COM 15-01. Both of these policies are available from the Wayside Cleanup Policies and Guidance page on the web. So let's start with the generic fill project. This could be a big hole in the ground that needs to be filled, or it could be a relatively small construction project that needs to bring in some fill material. Let's start with a 21E disposal site that's generating excess material. Well, since it's a 21E disposal site, 310 CMR 40.0030 applies to any soil that's moved from that 21E site. And what are the requirements that apply? First, the soil can't be contaminated soil, which means it's not remediation waste, which means the concentrations are less than the reportable concentrations in the MCP. Second, the soil that you're excavating and shipping off-site must be similar to the soil that is already present at the receiving location. This is where the Similar Soils name comes from. There's LSP oversight and sign-off. Somebody is responsible and looking after the soil and managing it appropriately, and they are putting their name and they are stamping the documents that say that this soil is appropriate to go to that location. And it must be documented as part of that MCP response action. All of this work is subject to audit by the Wayside Cleanup Program. And finally, we put out a policy, Wayside Cleanup 13-500, that describes and gives you more information about how best to meet these requirements. That's the Similar Soils policy tied back to the soil management requirements of the MCP. So soil coming from a 21E site has regulations and policies that apply. And of course, many sites might be sending soil to the same fill project. And that fill project could be receiving soil from a generic location that's not a 21E site. Perhaps it's just a construction project that is digging a basement and creating excess soil. And since that generic location is not a 21E site, the rules and regulations and policies and procedures of the MCP do not apply. Remember, we're just talking about soil management at the moment. There are a lot of other rules that might apply to a particular project, including state and local and federal requirements, such as the rules in the wetlands regulations against filling wetlands. Where it says not regulated, it really means just from the soil management criteria perspective. Okay, now let's take a look at a reclamation soil project that is going along under COM 1501. The project will have an administrative consent order, or ACO, which means it has an approval from DEP, and thus it's considered a facility or location that is licensed, permitted, or approved to accept soil. That qualifies this location for an MCP notification exemption, providing a liability protection for people who may be sending soil to that property. The ACO, which is signed by the project proponent as well as DEP, is a mutually agreed upon set of required criteria that the project has to meet, including the acceptance criteria for the concentrations of oil hazardous material in the soil, management plans for how the soil will be moved around and placed, agreements for third-party oversight, the documentation that will be needed for the project, and a whole list of other requirements. All of that is written into the ACO, and all of that is enforceable. So now let's look at the rules that would apply to projects sending soil to a COM 15 reclamation project. If the soil is coming from a 21E site, that soil has to meet the requirements of the MCP, 310 CMR 40.0030, just like any other 21E site, and they have to meet the requirements of the COM 15-01. The real difference is that soil coming from some generic location also has to meet the requirements of COM 15-01, or it can't be accepted for that reclamation project. That way, any soil being shipped to a reclamation project that has an ACO under COM 15 will have very specific requirements, testing requirements, documentation requirements that go along with that, regardless of where it's coming from. Now let's go back and revisit the generic fill project that does not have an administrative consent order and is taking in soil not only from 21E sites, but also from generic locations. There's nothing wrong with that. It's allowed, but we do describe that as being conducted, quote, at risk. What does that mean exactly? Well, the receiving location is essentially unregulated. Again, that's just from the soil management perspective. There are other rules that might apply. There might be diligent oversight and very strict and health protective acceptance criteria. The soil may be managed perfectly. There might be great documentation of the work that's being done there. It might all be of the highest quality. And then again, it might not. And if a problem does come up, such as if the fill project takes in soil that has concentrations of oil or hazardous material greater than the MCP reportable concentrations, then that creates a notifiable condition, which creates a 21E disposal site, which creates joint and several liability for everybody who's involved in the process, from the point of excavation all the way down to the point of placement in the generic fill project. That includes facility owners, operators, soil transporters, owners of the source location, etc., etc., etc. And whenever the question of liability comes up, I would always recommend that you consult an attorney for details and do not simply rely upon the advice of a 5-minute instructional video. So there you have the differences between the Similar Soils Policy and the Reclamation Soils Policy, all in a nutshell, and the basics of soil management in Massachusetts. If you have any other questions, please feel free to send them along to bwsc.information@state.ma.us. Thank you.